Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ann Chisholm, and I was the chair of this year's judging panel for the Penn Hessell Tiltman Prize. And I'm very happy indeed to be here, and thank you for coming. First, my congratulations to David Reynolds, the very distinguished Cambridge historian, for winning the 2013 Hessell Tiltman Prize, which is awarded annually for a book that's both distinguished as history and written so as to please and engage the general reader. When the three of us who judge this prize, and I'm very sorry, as are they, that neither Michael Prodger nor Anna Whitelock, whose contributions to the discussion were both expert and amusing, could be here today. So you've just got me. When we began our task around the middle of last year, it soon became clear that war, one way or the other, was going to dominate the submissions. Given that we were reading on the brink of the centenary of the First World War, it was not surprising to find a number of new books on that subject coming in. More so was the almost equally large number of books on aspects of World War II. In the end, of the 50 or so books we considered, half were concerned with war, one way or the other. Clearly, the need to revisit the two great European conflicts of the 20th century continues to drive writers, readers, and publishers. Even so, we had no sense of being obliged to choose any of them, anniversary or no anniversary. In fact, rather the reverse. The spate of books on war was slightly daunting, which made the books on other topics rather a relief. None of us, I think, were naturally avid consumers of books about war. And I, as chair of the judges, responsible for the initial division of the task, we each did a first reading of a third of the list, then composed our joint shortlist out of our individual top choices, was very careful to see that the war books, many of them extremely fat, were shared equally. The Long Shadow was only published a month before the submissions deadline, so that it was in fact only at our first meeting early in December that Anna Whitelock, who I think had been at a Cambridge launch for the book, brought the book to our attention, so that the other books in contention for the shortlist and eventually the prize were already well on the way to being selected. Over the next few weeks, as we conferred by email, it became clear that The Long Shadow was greatly impressing us all. I remember at my desk the week before Christmas writing "winner?" in capitals in my notebook. The question mark did not remain long, and I arrived for the final judging lunch in February, quite clear in my own mind that David Reynolds' book deserved the prize. I've learned while judging prizes that it's wise not to show one's hand too soon, so I was prepared to lie low and let my co-judges argue their choices and disagree with me if they wished. In the end, though, there was animated discussion but little argument and no disagreement. We were happily unanimous. I do strongly urge that if you only read one book about the First World War during the 4 anniversary years we've embarked on, make it this one. The good news is that with a BBC television series based on it coming up in November, many more people than already know about it from the excellent reviews will surely be drawn to read it. I am not going to attempt to summarize its scope and arguments, particularly since David and I will be having a bit of a discussion afterwards and you can ask questions yourselves. I just want to say what attracted and impressed me most about it and what makes me regard it as achieving brilliantly what the best historical writing can do. This book takes a familiar subject and looks at it in a new way, challenges received ideas, stampedes sacred cows, brings fresh insights, and sometimes startlingly bold generalizations to bear on long-established, cherished opinions. Somehow, with this combination of deep scholarship, originality of analysis, and great readability, David Reynolds manages to do all this without ever being patronizing or over-provocative. First, he considers the legacies of the First World War up till 1939, not just in Britain, but internationally. And then he traces, after the Second World War until the present, how the stories and assumptions of what was no longer then the Great War changed and developed. He shows how the preoccupations of the present affect how we interpret the past. One of his themes is how, during the 1960s, the image of the First World War as one of pointless slaughter, immortalized by the poets we all revere, came to dominate popular imagination. He offers a corrective to that view of the conflict. in his words, as a saga of personal tragedies illuminated by poetry, not history, a subject for remembrance rather than understanding. His aim has been, without in any way diminishing the importance of individual stories or heroic endurance, to add context and perspective now that 100 years have passed. We need, as he puts it, gently but firmly, to shift our view of the Great War out of the trenches. This he has begun to achieve. David Reynolds' book, The Long Shadow, is accomplished, intellectually stimulating, and a pleasure to read. I'm honoured and delighted to have been part of awarding him the Penn Hessell Tiltman Prize. And I shall now present him with a cheque.
Thank you very much, Ed. That's very kind of you. Well, I'm very moved at your comments. It's very generous. This isn't, in many ways, it isn't a war book, because like you, I have an abhorrence of war. I'm grateful to be part of a generation that has not had to do national service and has not had to fight. But it's really a book about how that war and the next war have shaped our sense of who we are as a country. And so it's about war and peace and the intersections between them. It's also, I think, driven by a feeling that at a time when we are all instructed to study British history more closely, that the only way we will understand the history of this country is by putting it into a comparative perspective. I think there's an old adage, what do they know of England who only England know? And that's part of what I've tried to do in this book. The other thing that has been really exciting about it is the sense that it's just about, I think, just over a year ago that I pressed the button and sent the manuscript down to Mike Jones and his team at Simon & Schuster. And like any book, there's a real sense of letting go of something and not quite knowing what's going to happen. And the amount of discussion this year about the war, about its importance, about its place in British life and international life, it's been a real pleasure to be part of that. And my view of writing books is that no book is ever definitive. A book is one's own personal contribution to a debate in which you put some ideas into the pot, you stir it up a bit, and then you see what happens and what other people do with it. So a prize like this, particularly by an organization that is so conscious of the need for free discussion, seems to me to be a particularly appropriate accolade, and I'm very grateful for it, because that's the kind of thing I want to contribute to, free discussion. So I'm extremely grateful for this prize. Thank you.
I was wondering, I mean, you do take on previous accounts, don't you, quite often? I mean, one example is where you put a slightly different spin on Barbara Tuchman's famous book, The Guns of August, and the way that was famously used by President Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis and while he was thinking about the Americans in Vietnam. I think you remind us that he made. Did he make ministers, or did he make his cabinet read it, or he put it in army?
He instructed that a copy should be in every officer's mess on every American base all over the world. What Kennedy was struck by there, this is a book about going to war in 1914, was the sense that countries could actually end up in a major crisis without ever intending it. And he was very conscious in this case of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in fact, only the other day I was discussing with Lord Owen, David Owen, his own book on 1914, which has been written very much in the shadow of the Chilcot Inquiry, which will come out later this year, about how we got into the war in Iraq. And so I think that one of the striking things that, as you read about the First World War, is that different countries, different people reinvent the First World War at different times for their own purposes. They attach to it particular kinds of meanings. And Kennedy had a very acute sense of what lessons he drew from that war. Others draw different lessons.
I just want to ask David one more question, and then we'll see what questions you want to ask. The question of the war poets. Have you found people taking exception to your attitude or your suggestion that we have been too dominated in this country by the rediscovery of those war poets?
Yes. Well, the rediscovery of a few war poets in the 1960s. I mention in the book, it's not a piece of original research, I've used other people's work, that there were 2,200 writers who published poetry during the Great War. Of those, 80% were civilians, and nearly a quarter were female. But our view of the war poets is very much a few officers, often public school educated, often complexed about their masculinity, about their courage and their identity. It's figures like Brooke, Sassoon, Owen, who have become the iconic war poets. And it seems to me that that's to mistake the nature of the kind of poetry that was written during the war, and to narrow too much our view of what war poetry was to a few people who wrote and who were popularized, particularly in the 1960s, through the poetic anthologies that came around at the 50th anniversary of the war. I was very struck in writing the book, just parenthetically, that the anniversaries were hugely important. The 10th anniversary of the end of the war, the 50th anniversary in the 60s, in reshaping people's attitudes to the conflict. And I think the huge amount of discussion that will happen over this year, the 100th anniversary, will have the same kind of effect. I don't know what the outcome will be. It's a much more diverse and much less controlled debate now. Not even Michael Gove can control it. And I think it will produce all sorts of interesting things. But I suspect this will provide a certain sea change in public attitudes to the war.
Just one more quick question. Was it to do with the 50th anniversary of the war that Oh, What a Lovely War was first put on?
It was around that time, yes.
It was early 60s, because I
yes,
saw
that's
it
right.
then.
Yeah,
I remember.
yes.
Yeah.
Oh, What a Lovely War, the play, and then of course Richard Attenborough's movie as well. Yes, no, that was part of that whole creation of the war as very much an exercise in futility and class conflict, really. So.
Yeah, and it's just now been revived again.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
at the Theatre Royal Stratford,
well,
which is where it started. Yeah. Yeah.
I think now, does anyone have a question from the floor? Over there?
Okay. You mentioned Michael Gove, and obviously there's a lot in the news recently about the impact of the war on the 20th century and Michael Gove stepping forward and various others. What do you think, or how do you think the war and its impact should be taught to impressionable teenagers in our secondary schools?
I think it should be. I think they should be encouraged to see this as a whole. In other words, not just about the trenches on the Western Front. This was, for example, the first total war in British history. It requires a huge effort on the home front from civilians, women, children, families, the reorientation of industry, of society. I would like people to understand that as well. It has a huge knock-on effect in terms of, say, for example, the debate on votes for women. It changes the whole terms of that from the suffragette movement before the war. I would like people to be more aware of the global dimensions of this war. It obviously affects the Middle East. It has a big impact, and one we don't take very seriously at the moment, on India, China, Japan, these countries as well. So I would hope that teachers can open up some sense of those diversities of the war and not just consider it as an act of remembrance of soldiers who died. A huge number, of course. This was the worst war in British history, 720,000 dead. But the men who fought at Waterloo, men who fought in 1914, are now as far away from us as they were from the soldiers who fought at Waterloo. It's 100 years away in distance and time. And I think we need to see the war as history and not just as acts of remembrance, though those acts of remembrance are important as well. There's another question.
Was there another question?
Speak quite closely into it.
Right. I was interested in your bringing in the international aspect of the First World War. The first time the Americans had become involved and having to take a role as an international power. And I wondered how they have built on that. Was that the beginning of their views of international becoming a very powerful nation?
Sorry, I didn't catch the they. Is it the United States?
The United States,
Yes.
yes.
Well, it's the first time the United States is really engaged in a European conflict in any way. I mean, obviously as a belligerent, but even as a neutral power, it has a huge effect. It's also the point at which America's whole economy turns outwards. Instead of the huge amount of investment in the late 19th century in building up the United States and its economy, suddenly American investors are encouraged to invest in Europe, initially to support the British and French war efforts, but then that carries on, huge amount of American investment in Germany and after the war. So yes, I think it reorients as America towards Europe, towards a sense of having a role as a world power. But then, of course, there's a period in which after the Depression, the Americans get cold feet. The Depression is a psychological thing as much as an economic thing. And the Americans say, you know, to hell with Europe, we're not having any more to do with it. And it takes another war to make them feel that they want to carry on Woodrow Wilson's vision of being a country that's the bastion of democracy. And indeed, when the United Nations is being sold to the American public by the State Department, it's billed as America's second chance, having blown the League of Nations. Now it's the second chance to redeem the world and make America into a world power. So I think it has a huge effect, but a sort of slightly erratic effect. And one of the things I've tried to bring out in the book is that for each country involved, not least our own, the war of 1914-18 is seen against the war of 1939-45. One often as a positive, one as a negative, or different ways, different versions of this. But we now refer to this as the First World War. Nobody who fought it obviously thought of it as the First World War. In Britain, it was known as the Great War. It becomes the First World War only when we have a second war. So those two wars in different countries are always seen in parallel, in contrast or whatever, and particularly so for the Americans. There it's a story of stepping up gradually to run, as they saw it, the American century.
Does anyone else have a question?
I'm a publisher, and I've spoken to a lot of German publishers this week about books of history, and it seems to me that there's very little interest in Germany about the events of the First World War. We've got anniversaries all the way through this year, and we'll carry on throughout the whole 4 years. What's your view of the way that the German nation now looks back on the First World War?
I think that the Germans are not complexed about this war in the way we are. It's an obsession for us. For the Germans, it's a story that most of them are kind of picking up again fairly recently. The German, I think, way of presenting this is to see both those wars as tragedies, and ones in which Germany was centrally implicated. Obviously the second one, but also the first one. That is still the general received wisdom. But also as tragedies from which Germany has moved on. Germany and France and its neighbours. So for them, it's part of a narrative which takes us from 1914 to 1945 and on to 1957 to the Treaty of Rome, to the creation of the European Community. And that's if you like, the peace treaty between France and Germany, the one that was never effectively signed in 1945, but is the point at which France and Germany finally stopped fighting. And so when the Germans will do commemorations of this conflict in the summer, I'm going to one event in Berlin run by the German president at the end of June, it's a mixture of looking back, but also looking forward and celebrating a European unity and European integration that makes it impossible to imagine that kind of war happening again on the continent of Europe. And that, of course, is a narrative and a view of the European community that is not very common in this country. As you well know, if you go to France or Germany, I was in France the other week, every mairie, every town hall will have the European community, the European Union flag outside there, as well as the tricolour and so on. That's not the sort of thing that would happen here. It would probably be a cause of political controversy if local governments did that sort of thing. We celebrate, discreetly a twinning with some unpronounceable place somewhere in Central Europe, but we don't celebrate being part of the European Union in the way that for the Germans and for the French, it's absolutely central to their identity now.
I think just before we finish, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the television series, about what's going into it and how you've organised it.
Well, it's a 3-part series, and it obviously can't cover all the things in the book. What we've done is to take 3 themes. The first program is about the notion of memory, about remembering and understanding. In other words, trying to move on beyond the war itself as an act of commemoration to think about it as history, and tracing that story through the 20th century with a lot of about the contrast between Britain and Germany. And then I've taken 2 themes, one about democracy, the way that democracy explodes in Europe in 1918 as a kind of big bang as a result of the conflict. Much of that's in chapter 2 of the book. And then the other theme is nationalism, that this is a war that, again, starts a huge debate about national identity. And that's a theme that I explore in the film with reference to the United Kingdom, to issues such as Scottish devolution, and also to Ireland, but again doing it in parallel with looking at continental Europe, and in this case particularly the continental countries, Czechoslovakia. So I'm trying to take the approach of the book, comparative history, and some of the themes, and doing it in a reasonably interesting televisual way for the viewers.
Well, I think in that very short time you've heard enough to see what an original book this is. It's sort of fizzing with ideas. It pulls together a lot of stuff. It goes all over the place. It's completely brilliant, as I've said already more than once. I'm sure we all want to thank David Reynolds very much indeed for talking about it this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ed.